Good morning, teachers, students, parents, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sandra Gift, and I am a member of the network of scholars of the Center for Reparation Research at the University of the West Indies. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for this morning's lecture. The Center for Reparation Research fosters public awareness of the lasting and adverse consequences of the European invasion of indigenous peoples' lands, African enslavement, and colonialism in the Caribbean. It works with national and regional reparation committees to promote education about these legacies and the need for justice and repair. Accordingly, the Center is collaborating with the St. Lucia National Reparations Committee, the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and other partners to host this regional secondary schools virtual lecture series 2020-2021. The topics addressed relate to the CXC, CSEC, and CAPE history curricula and are intended to contribute to enhancement of the knowledge and awareness of young people of the Caribbean of the historical factors that have shaped the socioeconomic realities of the region. Today's lecture focuses on the topic Deceptive Asian Indentureship, Resistance, and the Abolition of Contract. Indentured laborers were brought into the Caribbean to provide a workforce that would replace enslaved Africans. These laborers were in chronological order: Chinese, Africans again, whites, Portuguese, Syrians, Lebanese, and East Indians, with East Indians accounting for the largest group. This impacted on Caribbean society demographically, economically, and culturally. Relevant components of the CSEC syllabus include coming of the Chinese, Europeans, Indians, and Africans, under which theme are examined push and pull factors that led to migration in the 19th century, working and living conditions of immigrant groups in the Caribbean, and effects of immigration on the social, cultural, and economic life of the Caribbean. The issue of indentureship is also relevant under Theme 5 of the CSEC syllabus, which focuses on adjustments to emancipation, 1838 to 1876. Here, objectives relate to problems affecting the sugar industry in the Anglophone Caribbean, 1838 to 1854, attitudes to labor in the region after 1838, the various schemes of migration as a solution to the problems of labor, the effects of immigration on the sugar industry, and the impact of selected migrant groups on society. In respect of the CAPE syllabus, the topic of indentureship is relevant to Unit 1, Module 3, Freedom in Action, for example, which includes, among areas of focus, new immigrants establishing new identities and social relations in the 19th century, and settlement and citizenship of Chinese, Indians, and Portuguese up to 1900. So these areas of the CXC history syllabi provide the general context for today's lecture. We really would like to include your voice in the discussion. So do ask questions when we come to the question and answer segment. To start us off, Mr. Earl Bousquet, Chair of the St. Lucia National Committee for Reparations, will deliver the welcome message and greetings. Mr. Bousquet?
You're muted, Mr. Bousquet.
Yes, good morning. Good morning to all, and welcome to this our seventh in the series of the 2021 Virtual Schools Lectures, sponsored, as Dr. Gift indicated, by the St. Lucia National Reparations Committee in cooperation with the Center for Reparations Research. Our theme today: deceptive Asian indentureship, resistance, and abolition of contract labor, was specifically selected to offer you, our history students in particular, additional perspectives on another issue covered in your history studies based on curriculum materials and in line with the guidelines outlined by curriculum development for schools as indicated by Dr. Gift. And as the theme suggests, today's lecture will proceed from the standpoint that Asian indentureship was deceptive and there was resistance that led to its abolition. But as always, this is not what's been taught to and learned by generations of Caribbean students over the last 2 centuries. And we get different interpretations of what indentureship actually meant, from what it was meant to be to what it turned out to be, and how that manifested in different West Indian and Caribbean societies over generations. Like African descendants, you will also find Indian, Chinese, and Portuguese descendants in every Caribbean territory at varying percentages of population, but all there all the time. In some societies, in some Caribbean societies, the relationship between African and Indian descendants have been troubling even while coexisting. In other cases, no such thing. Stories about these relationships are colored by the history of each relationship, whether antagonistic or cooperative, but again, forced to coexist within the same boundaries and affected similarly by all that happens in and to each country. In some cases, you as students will get antagonistic political and ethnic confrontations arising from historical considerations. These you will see, these you will learn about. But in most cases, you will find that the interrelationship between Africans and Indians and other sections of the society is cooperative and respectful and based on equity of citizenship. But in most cases, we will also find that while the relationship between Indians and Africans is favorable and without conflict, there is still not enough known about how Indians arrived in the Caribbean, just like not many know why Europeans called our part of the world the West Indies. In St. Lucia, for example, there are many areas historically dominated by a strong presence of Indian descendants, Auger, Forestier, Mark, but very little is being learned and or taught as to when and why Indians arrived in St. Lucia and what their contributions have been to St. Lucian society. It is issues like these that we wish to encourage you as students to also pay attention to as you study the Caribbean's history with a sense of learning that full history, the entire Caribbean history, and not just sections or aspects selected for study for exams, absolutely important as that is. Today's lecture, therefore, is intended to put all of that in a historical perspective and offer, as per usual, new insights that will interest not only students but teachers as well, not only schools but all who listen and participate. It is coming ahead of Indian Arrival Day observances in different countries at different dates across the region. which are unfortunately in too many cases only left to be observed by Indian descendants and not by the entire nation that they share. So therefore, we are all part, I want to remind us, of a multicultural and multinational region representing many people on each island and in each territory, but one Caribbean. We therefore once again welcome you as we invite you, students and teachers, principals and parents, guardians, and all online with us right now across the region to give all the attention to Dr. Sharian Singh when she takes charge of today's class in a few minutes. And we also look forward to your participation by sending us your questions online in advance if you care to, and during the presentation. But we absolutely look forward to your participation. And thanks once again. Back to you, Dr. Gift.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buske. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharian Singh, who is our presenter for today's lecture. Dr. Sharian Singh is a lecturer of Indian Diaspora Studies and Indian History in the Department of History, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus, Trinidad and Tobago. She specializes in the social, religious, and cultural transformation among Indians in Trinidad and Tobago and in the Caribbean, in Hinduism and the Ramayana tradition in the Indian diaspora, and on the Indian indenture system. She has held fellowships at the Center for the Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore, India, and at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. She has earned the Young Caribbean Scholar of the Year Award from George Bell Institute of Queen's College, Birmingham, UK, 2004. In addition to many published articles, her monograph, The Ramayana Tradition and Socio-Religious Change in Trinidad, 1917 to 1990, was published in 2012. She is currently head of the Department of History in the Faculty of Humanities and Education at the St. Augustine campus. Dr. Singh, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gibbs, and thank you, Mr. Buske, for inviting me. Let me also express my thanks to the St. Lucia National Reparations Committee and the Center for Reparation Research at the UWI for inviting me to speak at this forum. I know that the theme today is Deceptive Asian Indentureship with a focus on resistance and the abolition of contract labor. And of course, I've been asked to look at that theme through the lens of the Indian perspective. So essentially what I'm going to do today is an examination of the Indian indenture system. I would be looking at circumstances leading to the system. I'll be looking a bit on the actual system itself, and then also at what happened after the system was terminated. So we'll get straight into it, Indian indenture in the Caribbean. I would like to give a bit of context before I get into the actual system, essentially what was happening prior to the arrival of the Indians in the Caribbean. First of all, I'll give you a Caribbean context, and a bit later on, we will talk about the Indian context. So some of what I'm going to say now in terms of the Caribbean context, I'm sure that you students would be aware of it. So there was the situation of the abolition of African enslavement by 1834. And of course, post-abolition, we know that, the former enslaved Africans, they, were now requesting, and rightfully so, there were demands for better wages, better working conditions, and so forth. Now, what they weren't aware of was the fact that the colonial authorities, colonialism, British colonialism, had already set certain things in place. And one of those things that the British had already set in place was a very huge available labor force in India. And we'll talk about how that process worked in a little while. So by 1834, the British already had a ready waiting labor force in India. But, the Africans did not know, the former enslaved individuals, they did not know. So what the British had, they had bargaining power. And of course, the former enslaved did not see this coming at all, because they thought now, in their heads, they were the ones to provide the labor, the only ones to provide the labor at that point. So they had the bargaining power, but they didn't know that there was another source. So the Indians now, provided a chip for colonialism. So instead of giving in to demands for better wages and working conditions, the British decided now to draw on that other source of labor that they had already established in India. And hence, the Indians were brought because of this reason. Especially for students, I know there is this running view that Indians were brought to fill a gap in labor in the Caribbean, but there was no gap in labor. There was a workforce. However, the British preferred, it was more economical for them to bring the Indians as indentured laborers than to increase wages for the former African enslaved individuals, okay? So the Indians were brought, and neither side, neither the Indians nor the Africans were the wiser. The Indians knew nothing of the context that they were coming into. And the Africans, they were totally, taken by surprise with this new group of individuals to provide labor. So one can easily understand that right away throughout the Caribbean, Indians were seen as economic competition by the Africans, because in their minds, if these people didn't come, we would have had more bargaining power, or these people came and literally took away our bread and butter, so to speak. Okay, so Indians were seen as competitions. The Indians themselves now, new environment, totally new and alien in so many ways, physical, cultural, geographic differences. So of course, over time, seeing that there was a negative response by the Africans towards them, they responded likewise, in addition to the fact that they were total strangers in the area. So this, they responded with, indifference, suspicion, fear of the unknown, scorn of the unknown sometimes, okay? It's general differences. But what my spin on this whole thing, and of course this is just my perspective, is that the long-standing racial tension that we continue to experience in the Caribbean is as a result of, how colonialism chose to deal with this situation post African enslavement. They chose to bring the Indians as competition rather than provide better wages and so forth. And of course, they just did it, unknown to either side. So that is just my perspective, that, this racial undercurrent that we seem to have in many areas of the Caribbean, it is rooted in this particular issue. Okay, so that is just the Caribbean context. So between 1838 and 1917, you had approximately, and I say approximate because, people are still researching their, and they, even up to now, people come up, they come across new documents and so forth that would change numbers and so on slightly. So I will use approximation. So approximately 500,000 Indians were brought to the Caribbean under the scheme of Indian indenture. And as you can see from the table, the largest number would have gone to British Guyana, then to Trinidad, and then to Guadeloupe. Well, very smaller numbers now to Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Dutch Guyana, Suriname, then Martinique, around 25,000, French Guyana, close to 19,000, and then very small numbers going to St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, around 4,300, 3,200, 2,400 respectively. Okay, so the table breaks down the distribution of Indians to the Caribbean. And right away, with the huge difference in numbers to British Guyana and Trinidad, we can right away understand why the current dynamics of Indians in Guyana and Trinidad would be different from, let's say, the group from Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Dutch Guyana, Suriname, Martinique, and then very small numbers in St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent. So the numbers, and that's not just the only factor, but the numbers would be a factor in what happened after indenture with Indians in the various locations in the Caribbean. Okay. Moving on a bit now to this map of India, and it shows you a bit of the areas from where the indentured laborers were drawn. Most of the indentured laborers were drawn from the what the states called Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, northern provinces, some also from Bengal, and a small proportion from southern parts of India. So currently in the Caribbean, the Indians who are here are descendants of these regions, essentially the northern regions of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And of course, by extension, what is seen as Indian culture in the Caribbean will be reflective of this, because India is a vast subcontinent, not just in size physically, but it is culturally, in terms of culture, religion, it is very diverse. So what we have in the Caribbean with Indians is a North Indian, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, colloquially referred to as Bhojpuri or Bihari culture in the Caribbean, with sprinklings of, influences from South India. Then of those immigrants who came, you had the bulk, of course, of the immigrants being males, because the focus was on extraction of labor. Of course, females would come. You had, throughout the period of indenture, a very, very skewed ratio between males and females. Sometimes it was as bad as 5 males to 1 female on a ship, on any one shipment. They did attempt to address this issue. However, the best it ever got was 2 to 1. 2 females to 1 male. And of course, that would lead to problems later on. So emphasis was on extraction of able-bodied males between the ages of 20 to 30 years of age. That's the age that you would be able to secure most, extract most labor from. Okay, so a preponderance of males over females and emphasis on the age group 20 to 30 years. This slide attempts to show you a bit about religion of the religious makeup of the migrants. Of course, the bulk may be about 80 to 85%, depending on the location, whether Trinidad, St. Vincent, St. Lucia. The bulk of the immigrants would be Hindus. Between 14 to, let's say, 16 or 17% would be Muslims. And there was a very minuscule, let's say, Christian or other, we'll put it as other, including Christians, Jains, Buddhists, and so on, composition. So the bulk of the migrants, of course, they belong to the Hindu religion, and the table sort of breaks it down for you a bit in terms of caste. Most of the laborers who came were from the lower caste of India. The agricultural caste also belonged to the lower caste, the two lowest castes. And then what was the Brahmin caste, which is the highest, or we can call it the priestly caste also. But for your knowledge, the bulk of the laborers came from the laboring lower classes of India. Now, this is very important. Let's look at some of the push factors in India. But before I get into the push factors, there is a question or an issue that always arises. Actually, there are two. One, there is a question of was indentured labor, or was the system of indenture another form of slavery? Okay, and we can go into the details, but my short answer would be no, it wasn't, but it was a form of unfreedom. Okay, it was not a form of slavery, but there were various shades and markers of unfreedom in the system. And the second issue is that of voluntariness. How voluntary was the system? Okay, and the general idea is that the Indians, well, it wasn't slavery, so the Indians, they came willingly. No, it wasn't slavery, but simply to say that they came willingly is not the absolute truth. To answer this, we need to understand the Indian context. Okay, now and that's why I'm going to look at the push factors a bit in India. What was happening in India around the time that Indian indentureship was initiated? Now, the British had been in India for a very long time. but they had become engaged in the politics of India, putting it bluntly, engaging in colonizing India from as early as 1757, various strategies and so on. Yeah. So by the time you got to, let's say, the 1830s in India, the very large portion, most of India was under British rule. There were certain small pockets that were still independent, but nevertheless, most of India was under British rule. So the British had about 2 centuries to really wreak havoc on the economic and social life of India. And these are some points that I have itemized to tell you what they were doing. They had commercialized agriculture. They were there for commercial purposes initially. So very quickly, as they gained political control of India, they started to use agricultural space, lands and so on that was previously geared towards production of food for India to feed itself. They started to use those agricultural spaces for non-food crop production. They were, for example, the British were interested in trading with the Chinese, and the Chinese just weren't interested in European goods. What the Chinese wanted was opium. So the British grew in India, they grew poppy to create the opium, which they would then sell to China for Chinese spices and so forth, and silks. Okay, they grew, of course, so poppy was planted. You had, a lot of emphasis on sugarcane, on indigo, non-food crops. Yeah. So of course now commercialization of agriculture would lead to a decline in food production. And in addition to producing less food, so now the economy was not able to sustain itself in terms of feeding itself. What was produced, there were times when that small amount even was exported to various parts of Europe, especially during the 2 World War periods. The British took the food from India and exported it to their troops fighting during those 2 world wars. And of course, the Indians were left to starve. Then, of course, in addition to the commercialization of agriculture, there was the mass destruction of local industries. When the British came into India, they found very vibrant industries. India was one of the largest producers of raw cotton and finished cotton products to the world. Very, very big producer and supplier of silks also. But the British, as colonialism would want to do, its colonies must be a provider of raw material, not finished products. So they employed various strategies and destroyed these industries in India. Okay. So by the time you got to the 1830s, there was mass destruction of local industries. And remember, when this happens, people are being rendered jobless. People who were working in these industries they had no jobs, okay? People who were working in agriculture, many of them, they had no jobs anymore because the British would not employ them. It wasn't certain that the British would employ them in this new commercialization process. Also, the British employed various land taxation policies and trade policies. Just one point I want to make about the destruction of industries before I move on. I mean, they used extreme measures to the point that sometimes they would cut off the thumbs of spinners of cotton so that these people, they could not, if they found somebody who was supplying cotton locally in the Indian context, as opposed to the British, they would cut off their thumbs so they could not spin. So there was a lot of brutality in the whole situation. In terms of land taxation and trade policies, the British doctored and they engineered various land taxation and trade policies towards their benefit, and that worked towards the detriment of the Indian economy. For example, before the British came to India, land was not private property, but they made it private property so that now land could be appropriated by the British from the Indians and sold as private property. So one of the land taxation schemes that they implemented, and many followed along similar trends, they would tell the Indians, so when the British got control of a particular place politically, everyone had to pay the taxes to the British. And so this was the point. The taxation was the point that the British would manipulate. So they would tell the Indian, would raise the tax, first of all, sometimes twice the amount, and regardless of whether they could pay it or not. And then they would tell the Indians, if you could not pay your taxes by a particular day, there was one law called the Sunset Law. If you could not pay your taxes by a particular day at sunset, your lands would now go to the British, as because of your failure to pay. And that happened. Many taxations were put in place because of that. So Indians lost their lands, they lost their means of livelihood, and of course now they were left with nothing. And think all the points I'm looking at, they point towards the creation of a landless labor market. You had the labor, but there was nowhere for the Indians to apply that labor because they had no land. So they could only work for the British. Trade policies were similar. Indian goods going out of India to Europe were expected to pay higher, much higher taxes than British goods coming into India. So of course that destroyed in Indian industries and produce further. Then of course, the Indian society was structured in such a way that you would have entire villages revolving around a particular skill or particular activity. So for example, you might have entire villages who are weavers. You might have entire villages who are producing cotton. You might have entire villages who are blacksmiths, okay? And of course, most people in agriculture in some form. So when, one particular industry, let's say cotton industry, was affected, it would impact on entire villages, okay? Various sizes of villages. So in this way, the social fabric, not just the economic fabric, but the social fabric was being destroyed, because if an entire village of weavers would be now displaced, they would have to leave that place and now go elsewhere in search of work. Okay, so it was sort of a domino effect, all intertwined, where British economic and trade policies and land taxation policies all worked together towards the creation of a landless labor force. All right, a huge, impoverished, landless labor force. And in addition to this, the British continued to, during the British period, there was a substantial increase in famines. And a lot of these famines were actually creations of the British. One British official, in fact, shamelessly said that if you wanted labor, just create a famine in an area. And they would do that. So they created these famines so that at least once in 2 years, there would be widespread famine. So what they did is that there was a situation where people would basically do anything for a meal. There were these famine camps set up throughout India, and wherever the British wanted physical labor to build bridges or whatever else, the Indians would come and they would tell them, okay, 1 day's work, and you would be paid with one meal. That was your wages for the day, a meal. And it was no substantial meal, okay? So bottom line, a number of factors came into play in India, all created by the British, so that by the time you got to 1838, there was already existent, created by the British, a huge impoverished labor force that would do practically anything, leave India included, to make a living, to feed themselves, to stay alive, okay? And this is just one image of the impoverishment that was taking place in India. I mean, you can see they're practically skeletal, these individuals, okay? So those were the push factors in India that, would create that labor force that the British would draw on from 1838 to replace, so to speak, the former African enslaved, the labor that was provided there. And instead of giving these former African enslaved that bargaining power, they now had this bargaining power in the form of the Indians. So let's move on a bit now into recruitment. And this also, now the points I looked at, the push factors, if you have to consider the question of voluntariness of the system, you have to look at all these points. And you also have to remember a very key point, that prior to colonialism in India, Indians were not prone to migrating out of India, for permanently. The wave around 1200 AD or so, you did have a wave of what we now know as gypsies moving out of India. That was the only wave, okay? But apart from that, Indians were not prone to leaving India, permanently. And then also, to answer this question of voluntariness or not, we have to look at the whole recruitment process. I will say from at the outset that, let's say, between the 1830s to about the 1870s, many of the Indians who were recruited really weren't sure about the whole system, where they were going and so forth. After the 1870s, the system became more stable. And of course, by then people had gotten word of what the system was really about. So, but prior to the 1870s, a lot of the Indians who embarked on the ships, they weren't very sure about what was happening. Many stories were given to them. There were those who were outrightly kidnapped, especially women, so they were physically kidnapped. There were those men and women who, various lies and stories were painted for them. Sometimes they would tell them the government needs your work, and that was a norm in India for the government to request or demand free labor from Indians. So they would tell them that the government needs your labor in Calcutta. To get to Calcutta, you have to make a long journey by foot. You also have to cross rivers. So it wasn't odd that they would embark on a boat and go across a large expanse of land, of water. If you stand on one bank of a river in India, like the Ganges, you can't see the other side. And you would take, with those slow moving ships, you would take quite a long time to get to the other side. So they would tell, this is one of the stories, they would tell them, sometimes they would tell them, okay, you're going to a place called Trinidad, for Trinidad, or Sharian for Suriname, because Trinidad means sugar, Chini means sugar. And they paint stories of easy work. You are going to sift sugar, nothing about planting and hard work. You are just going to sift sugar, easy money, and then you will come back. Or they might look at an individual, let's say, who is a potter, and they will tell this individual that there is a demand for your skill in this particular place. And if you go, you would make money. Yeah. So everybody, think of a population that's starving, that has nothing and nowhere to channel their labor, and now they are being presented with these stories of opportunities. So a lot of them would actually, in our local parlance, would be fooled into embarking on these ships. Sometimes when they embarked on the ships and they realized, wait, it's about 2 or 3 days and we're not seeing any land, then it would dawn on them that they've left India, or something to that sort, or then they would be told that they would have left India. And a few of them even jumped overboard, attempting to swim back to India, but of course they died in the process. Okay, so before the 1870s, there was a lot of, the whole system was very vague. And again, as I said, if you were to try to consider the issue of voluntariness, you have to consider this issue also. How were the Indians recruited? There was a lot of kidnapping, and, the reasons for migrating given to these individuals were very, very vague. There were also stories documented, not just stories made up, but official documents giving accounts of people being kidnapped and then being spotted by family members or friends on the trains taking them to Calcutta. Some of them were actually saved. There was this man who saw his wife, and he happened to be passing at the station, looked into the train and saw his wife there, and then she was able to tell him what was going on, and he got the police to get her off and so forth. And some people weren't lucky. Okay, so there was a lot of shadiness surrounding the recruitment of the Indians before the 1870s. And this chart that I have there just basically tells you of the process. All right, the person who actually recruited was someone known as the Arkatia, or recruiter. He was often a very shady character, sometimes one who's been in jail. He would be the one employed to make up these stories or to even kidnap these individuals. All right. Then each Arkatia would have a quota to recruit. When he has his quota, he would now take them to the licensed recruiter at a sub-depot. There were many sub-depots throughout India, and he would be paid. The licensed recruiter would then wait for his quota, which would be a large number, maybe about 100 or so. And when he has his quota from his various, Arkatias or recruiters, then he would now collect everybody and take them on that journey to the Calcutta depot, where they would wait for the ship. The journey on foot sometimes would be very, very long, weeks sometimes. And then, of course, when the railway was introduced in India, it would be shorter, maybe a day or two. Okay. Now, sometimes, when people are being kept in the depot was like a prison. Those sub-depots, and of course, the Calcutta depot, they were like prisons. Once you got in, you could not get out. All right. There were security guards, one door that was heavily guarded. At the depot, at the Calcutta depot, sometimes they would have, if there was a ship, they would go right away. And then sometimes they would have to wait for a while. At the depot now, before they embarked on the ship, and this was another part of the shadiness of the process in the early stages, the Indians would have to pass certain medical tests, and they had to be deemed fit to endure the journey, not for labor, but to endure the journey. So there was supposed to be a surgeon superintendent, but oftentimes, this didn't work as efficiently as it should. Sometimes, they would, if there was an Indian who didn't want to go, they would give the surgeon superintendent this particular person's name, but they would send a more willing person to be interviewed or to be examined. If there was an ill Indian, they would send a healthier one in his name to be examined. So a lot of, as I said, shadiness. Also, in terms of the contracts, right there and then, the Indians were supposed to sign the contracts. Of course, most of these migrants could not read. The contracts were done in 3 languages, Hindi, Arabic, and English, but they could read none of those 3. So they would, what would happen is that you would have the surgeon superintendent, and he would have an intermediary, usually an educated Indian, so to speak, and that person would be acting as translator. So his job would be to ask, to translate, so to speak, the contract for the Indians and ask the Indians if they agreed. And usually he would not tell the Indians what would be in the contract, because then they would know that they were leaving India. All right. So he would, that translator, that go-between, would tell the Indians whatever he felt they wanted to hear. And then they would put their thumbprint on the contracts. And then the translator would tell the surgeon superintendent, yes, the person has agreed to the contract. Okay, so that also was, that is something that needs to be considered when we look at the issue of voluntariness. How many of the Indians actually knew where they were going? How real was the system, or how much of a veneer was the system that was put in place to deal with indentureship, even the contracts? We'll talk about the contracts later. So once they got on the ship, regardless of whatever means, whether willingly, whether not so willingly, the surgeon superintendent, there was an individual on the ship also who was supposed to take care of them. And then when they landed, wherever in the Caribbean, the individual who was in charge of them was an individual known as a protector of immigrants. Each colony had a protector of immigrants, or the office of the protector of immigrants. And that person, that protector of immigrants, would now decide which immigrant is going to which estate. So he would now send them to the various estates. This is a picture of one of the ships, Fatal Razak. There were many ships. And of course, the journey sometimes from India to the Caribbean would last 3 months. Sometimes depending on the weather, the speed of the ship, there were 1 or 2 that lasted up, one actually that lasted up to 6 months, but usually it would be about 3 months. You on board the ship, it was very cramped, but they did attempt every day to keep the Indians on deck. They were fed 2 meals per day. If the weather was bad, they had to stay below deck and so forth. On the ship, a lot of atrocities took place, especially with regard to women or young girls even. You read books like Maharani's Misery, Coolitude, and so forth. Coolie Woman, you would have stories of young girls, and I mean sometimes below the age of 10, who would be raped, and enticed by these sailors and these British officials, in return for food. Sometimes basic as food, promising them maybe more food or a few more biscuits and so forth. And they would rape these women, or, with older women. It was supposed to be what you call consensual, but how consensual was it really if you are doing it for survival? Okay, but there were cases of young girls actually being raped, no promises of anything, actually being raped. So that occurred on the ships also. This is a shot of Indians arriving in Jamaica. So usually the large ships, and you can see it in the background, the large ships would be anchored a bit way off. They couldn't enter the harbor. And then you'd have these smaller boats would go and collect the Indians. In some cases, you had Indians were quarantined. Well, most cases they were quarantined. In Trinidad, for example, the Nelson Island, a separate island, was used for quarantine for the individuals. And in other islands, you had certain quarters that were used to quarantine the Indians before they were now assigned to various plantations. This here is, it's not very clear because of the scan, but it's an emigration pass. This is what the individuals would be filled out for each immigrant, okay? And there were categories like the person's name, the person's father's name, their age, their caste, the name of the district that they came from, and so forth. Now these you can say, and then you might say, well, okay, there was something, there were documents, but there was no care was really taken to actually fill these out. So sometimes, for example, father's name in India, no, but the concept of surname did not exist. So what would happen in order to fit the Indians into this colonial context, what the British would do when the Indians came, they would use the person's name as what we would call their first name, and then they would just automatically take the father's name and append it as the person's surname. Sometimes for caste, they didn't get it right. Now, caste is a Hindu system. So if there were Muslim immigrants, they would put, under caste, they would put Muslim or Musalman. And I've seen also in a registration of births form, even for the British, under caste, they put British. It borders on the ridiculous. But the point is, there was no attempt to differentiate, okay? So this is just by the way information. Right, so this is a picture of one of the quarantine spots on Nelson Island in Trinidad. The contract, let's move on a bit. So the contract, as I told you, it was written in 3 languages, English, Hindi, and Arabic, none of which Indians could read. The contract had stated in certain conditions, all right, not all of them. You have some, you had the length and terms of indenture in these contracts. Usually, well, the length kept changing of indenture. So the indenture, the laborer might go for 2 years first, and then additional 3 years, then it shifted to 3 years for a while, then 2 years. So it kept changing. Then the contract, especially for the Caribbean, they stipulated the idea of a return passage. So you, first of all, at the end of the day, had to complete 5 years labor, indentured labor. And then if you wanted to qualify for this return passage back to India, you couldn't get it right away. You had to re-indenture yourself for another 5 years, okay? Or if you wanted to go back before, then you had to pay your way. All right, so you only can get that return passage if you've completed 10 years, that's further 5 years. In terms of payment, the contract stipulated 25 cents per adult able-bodied male and 16 cents per female. Of course, the point to note is that more often than not, almost never did this 25 cents given to males. Wages were always lower than stipulated in the contracts. All right, we'll talk about wages in a while. The contract also stipulated a 45-hour work week, 6 days per week. But usually, most of the times, the Indians had to do 9 hours work. And then sometimes, instead of working in terms of days or hours, they were given tasks to perform. So sometimes these tasks would be extended or expanded so that, it would be more profitable for the British to use task work at certain times where more was done for less pay. That was always the emphasis, less wages, whatever to be done so that the Indians would be paid less. Okay, but note, so these were the main points that were stipulated in the contract. All right, and you can see right away, it's not everything. It did not say anything about conditions on the estate. Sometimes the contract would say that the Indians were to get rations in terms of food and so forth, but not all the times. All right, but specific conditions on the estates were not stipulated in the contract. Now, let's go a little bit into what actually happened on the estates. Now, as I said before, the Indians had to deal with a period of quarantine when they landed in the various colonies. I mentioned the contract. There was a long contract, and it was to be completed with the same employer, whether it was 2 years or 3 years. There were penal sanctions for breaches of the contract. So if you broke the contract, you could be charged, you could be jailed, and it definitely did happen. Okay, in Trinidad, Indians were granted land for just over a period of 10 years in lieu of, instead of the return passage. So because over time the British realized, not just in Trinidad but elsewhere, that it might be more feasible, we have enough labor, we don't need to bring more in. So let us offer the Indians the option to stay. And how do we make it attractive? We offer them land, 10 acres of land, and later on 5 acres of land if they were to stay and not return to India. So it was a payoff. Either you return with your grant or give up the grant for 10 acres of land or 5 acres of land and stay in Trinidad. So most of the Indians in Trinidad, over 90%, prefer the land, because at the end of the day, this was something in their eyes that was sure. If they were to return to India, they weren't sure what was going to happen. So that was in Trinidad. Then on the estates, when the Indians had completed their period of indenture, all right, and if they chose to stay wherever in the Caribbean, they had to have with them at all time, and I mean on their physical persons, a certificate of industrial residence, something that was commonly referred to as their freedom paper. And if an Indian was found outside of an estate without this paper, they would be thrown in jail. And the bottom line is, the Indian's word did not suffice. An Indian could not simply say, I have completed my period of indenture, I'm no longer indentured. That didn't suffice. They needed to see the freedom paper. If it's not there, you go to jail. All right? Well, we spoke about that point. Indians could re-indenture themselves, freely. They weren't forced to return at any one point. You did have some of the Indians returning. And these Indians were referred to as returnees. Now, they also found themselves in a bit of a situation. Now, remember, they left a very impoverished India. Some of them left their families, some of them who were kidnapped. There was this idea around that time that if an Indian crossed the ocean that was known as the Kala Pani or the Black Waters, they would lose caste. Now, for some individuals, if they were to go back to their families and their communities, they would be shunned because of the idea of losing caste. So because of various reasons, some of these returnees who went back to India, when they got to Calcutta, so they're in India, yes, but at that point, they didn't know what to do. Because one, from Calcutta, they had to find their way back to their villages if they could, if they knew how to. Most of them who went back did not have much money, so they didn't have the wherewithal. Some of them who actually went back to their villages, they were shunned because of the idea of of crossing the Kalapani. Some of them went back to their villages, and because of the economic and social displacement, they didn't find their villages. Sometimes entire villages, as I said, had to move, or they didn't find their families. So what could they do? A lot of them decided two things. They decided to return to the Caribbean. All right. So those who could afford it financially and had the money, many of them decided to go back to the Caribbean because at least they knew it was familiar. They knew that they could go back and maybe re-indenture themselves and so forth. In India, for them, because of the conditions, they didn't know what to do. And then for those unfortunate souls who did not even have the money to come back to the Caribbean, they stayed. So if you go to that port in Calcutta, in Calcutta, Garden Reach and so forth, around the port in Calcutta, you have these very, what we might call slums, all right? And they were referred to as floating communities. Floating because they comprised the people who were floating. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't go back to the Caribbean because they had no money. And of course, for various reasons, they could not go back to or find their villages. So these were a very displaced group of people, these floating communities. Life on the estates now, of course, life was bound by conditions of the contract. What was stipulated, yes. But on the estates, beyond what was said in the contract, these what we're going to look at, they were not said and outlined in the contract at all. Indians could not demand higher wages. They could not leave the estates without permission. If you wanted permission to leave the estate for whatever reason, you had to get written permission. And you were only allowed written permission to leave the estates twice per year. If you used up your two tickets, so to speak, you couldn't leave. So Indians were only allowed to leave twice per year. They could not live off the estates, all right, while indentured. they could not refuse assigned work. You could not say, you can't do this or you don't want to do it. Sometimes, even though, as I said before, even though the contracts did not stipulate, there would be a varying between task wages and daily wages, whichever brought more profit to the British. 9+ hour work days, as I mentioned, and there was also the employment of child labor on the plantation in a very smart way. At first, children maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, accompanying their parents, they would take the babies would go with their mothers because the mothers worked. All right, sometimes there would be the oldest immigrant maybe, and she can't work, so she would sit under a tree, and look after all the babies, and the mothers would come during time to feed them and so forth. But while these young babies would grow up, like about 4 or 5, they would start doing small tasks like picking up leaves and so on, and eventually they would graduate to what we call, the smaller gangs where they might do raking or small cutting of grass and so forth. So labor started from a very early age. There was this employment of child labor. And the contract certainly made no mention of wage cuts and stoppages. And that was something that was, it was common practice throughout the Caribbean or throughout the system of indenture, not just in the Caribbean. Wage stoppages, sometimes wages were blatantly withheld from maybe an entire estate, sometimes from an individual. The British found various ways of cutting wages, of keeping back wages, sometimes for 3 months on end, sometimes even as much as 6 months, and when they did pay them, they would not pay them the full amount. So if they kept back wages for 4 months, they might pay them for 2 months. And oftentimes when this happened, it would be because the Indians went on strikes and there were disturbances on estates. And wage cuts and stoppages in the Caribbean were the main causes of strikes and disturbances in certain parts like Trinidad, with the larger amounts of indentured labor, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, even Jamaica also. So this was, wages was the sore point, All right, so wage stoppages and cuts, although not part of the contract, they were, a common feature of life on the estates. And of course, the Indians on the estates, many times they occupied the same barracks that had been occupied by the former African enslaves. Sometimes there were huts constructed on the estates or right on the border of the estates so these Indians could live, but most of the times they stayed on the estates in these barrack houses. All right, of course, no privacy and so forth. Now, another main feature of estate life was, as I said, I have prosecution or persecution, you figure it out. The Indians were prosecuted as criminals for civil offenses. What were their biggest offenses? Refusing to work. Either they were ill or oftentimes when wages were not being paid, the Indians would retaliate by feigning illness or not coming for work. So there were 2 ways that this was classified, this staying away from work. If it was under 7 days, it was seen as absenteeism. And if it was over 7 days, it was seen as desertion. And of course, eventually the Indian would have to come back to work, or he or she would be found. And then they would be charged as criminals for these civil offenses. All right. Other offenses, so to speak, would be disobedience on the estates, threats to either each other or to an overseer or manager, and verbal assaults. Rarely, for the exception of British Guyana, where there were a lot of physical assaults and strikes and violence on the estates, most pertaining to wages. But most of the times these were small, what you can call offenses, and they were prosecuted as criminals. So they would either be fined a maximum of $14.40 or so, or they would be imprisoned for a maximum of 3 months. Sometimes there'll be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Okay. Also, no mention of all of that on the contract, but the Indians faced physical abuse on the estates. All right, they were beaten, and of course, the women were abused in different ways. There was violence towards women. There was sexual abuse. There was rape of the women, sexual abuse by Indian men and also by non-Indian, the overseers and so forth. Okay. Sometimes if the Indians would stay away, if there was a particular person who would, desert for a while, and then he would come back and then go back again. So, what they would do is that they would add up the days that he had deserted for, that he was absent for, and they would add on that collective amount to his indenture. So even if he had completed his formal indenture, they would tell him, okay, when you add up all the days, you stayed away for 45 days. Now you have to serve out those 45 days. Okay, so indenture would be extended. All of that was not in the contract. And I talked about the past. And another point to note is that laws change arbitrarily. Or from 1838 to 1917, there wasn't one set of laws. The laws kept changing. And of course, the Indians, they couldn't read or write. So they had to depend on word of mouth. So when they thought that a certain set of laws would obtain, and let's say they committed a petty crime with assault or threat, and thinking, well, okay, we'll be fine, then of course the penalty would have changed. So it was very confusing for them to have to handle the law. Okay, and as the laws changed, they became more and more strict or stringent. And this is just an image of Indians cutting sugarcane. You can see the way they're dressed also. It's some of them are wearing dhotis, short dhotis, of course. And the British would eventually have issues with this. They would say the Indians were dressing indecently, both men and women, because they were exposing too much. But then, you can't very well wear trousers to go and cut cane. Right. Now, theoretically, there were certain tools and measures put in place to protect the Indians, theoretically, all right? Usually, they're practically speaking, they were very ineffectual and they were very biased towards colonialism, all those planters and so forth, all right? Now, firstly, as I mentioned somewhere before, you had in each colony, there was the immigration department headed by the protector of immigrants. And that office and that individual was supposed to be the one who looked out for the Indians. That office was supposed to be the final court of appeal. If the Indians had a problem on the estate, whether against the manager or whoever, the immigration department or the office of the protector of immigrants was where they could go, all right? That office was responsible for formulating regulations specific to the Indians on the various colonies. The protector of immigrants was supposed to visit these estates frequently to ensure that the Indians were treated well, to ensure that the conditions on the estates were good. But these visits were actually, they just did it maybe twice a year, and they would inform the estates before they went, so that when the estates knew that a protector of immigrants was going to visit, they would make sure they would pretty up the estates and fix things up and so forth, so that the inspection would be passed. And of course, they would doctor up their wage records and so forth. So yes, on paper, you have this office and this individual and all these tools put in place, but what really happened was different from what was put on paper. All right, this office of the protector of immigrants was very frequently vulnerable to pressure from the planters. And apart from being vulnerable, they were openly biased. They were supposed to be there for the welfare of the Indians, but they more so protected that of colonial figures. Okay, and there was some protective immigrants who actually did their jobs, and they were actually looking out, for the Indians. But then they too would, even though they are, fighting for the Indians, they too would come under pressure for the planters, and many of them would buckle. Okay, so the Indians knew, it didn't take very long. They realized that yes, there are these measures in place. There was also the magistrates' courts, specifically some of them to deal with Indian issues. But very quickly, the Indian realized that, we have these systems, yes, but really and truly they are biased. It's just, a front, telling us that we can complain. But when we complain and, the matter goes to court, most of the times the Indians would lose. The Indians did not have money to pay for legal counsel, okay? They did not know the laws of the land. Most of them were illiterate in the language, okay? So they knew that there were those measures, but they quickly realized that these measures didn't work for them, all right? They feared victimization, because let's say an Indian complained against the planter, and maybe the planter would be fined or whatever. The Indian has to go back to that same plantation to face that same planter. So they feared victimization when they returned. So the fear of victimization, and of course the knowledge and the suspicion that the case will usually go towards the advantage of the planter, deterred them from actually complaining. And ironically, the British used this lack of complaints to argue that the Indians had nothing to complain about. What they said is that we have all these systems and structures in place, and only 1 or 2 Indians might actually complain. So that says that the Indians are happy. They have nothing to complain about. A bit on the physical conditions on the estates now. Of course, the Indians lived in the barracks, but the conditions were extremely subhuman, lack of privacy, inadequate ventilation, unsanitary, of course, especially poor drinking water supply, and of course, excuse me, lack of proper toileting facilities or latrines then. So what the Indians would do, and this is something that they were, it's a habit that they brought with them from India also. Sometimes even though there were rudimentary latrines, whatever the conditions, in India, in the villages, sometimes the norm was to use the fields, a very remote part of the field. And in India, it worked because that part of the field was almost designated as a toileting facility. So nobody would go there afterwards to plant or to walk or whatever. But on the estates, now when the Indians used the field, the point is the colonial authorities did not designate that plot as a toilet. So then they would have to go back to that same plot to work and to pass and to walk in. So of course, nobody had shoes. So what would happen because of these very poor unsanitary conditions, and Indians would also, because of poor water supply, sometimes they would end up drinking and using water from drains to cook, okay? Very unsanitary. So diseases such as malaria, dysentery, cholera, were common, yellow fever, smallpox outbreaks you had sometimes, but most common were hookworms. Indians were often infested with hookworms, and they were often anemic because they were walking barefooted in very unsanitary conditions on the ground and so forth, all right? In terms of health facilities, as per the contract, as per the regulations that varied, each estate was supposed to have a health facility, whether a hospital and so forth, but these were usually in very, very poor conditions. Sometimes these health facilities were so badly off that patients refused to go. And sometimes if Indians were taken to these health facilities, they would run away because of how poor the facilities were and go back on the estates. And of course, a very sad feature of the indenture system, especially before the 1880s, was high infant mortality rates because of collective conditions of poor drinking supply, water supply, unsanitary conditions, poor nutrients and so forth, okay? Here you have an image of, a group of Indians, what they're doing there. You'll see a couple of them, they're holding 2 books in their hands. One of them is holding a musical instrument, a drum. And if you look to the back of the picture, you will see a small white structure. And even though there were restrictions in terms of practice of religion and culture, very early on from, let's say, the 1880s or so, the Indians, especially the Hindus, started to construct these very rudimentary structures that they used as a temple. So they were not very big, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, very small. And it basically was the house and the image, maybe 1 or 2 images of their gods. So on the estates too, you saw signs of religion and culture in very small ways, being implemented. Social life on the estate, big problem, acute male-female imbalance in terms of the numbers. So of course, unstable family life, women, were in high demand. There was a lot of competition for women. It also led to violence against women, sexual abuse of women. There was breakdown of traditional systems, family, caste, community. The Indians were there to work. They were there as labor sources. So no emphasis was placed on family, caste, and community. Restrictions on cultural practices. You could not, they were said to be disturbing the peace. Hindus could not cremate. Indian marriages were not legally recognized. And because of that, inheritance was often taken back by the states because the children were seen as bastards. All right, so they could not inherit property. There was no emphasis on educating Indian children except when the Canadian Presbyterian Mission came to the Caribbean, and they did so especially in Guyana and Trinidad. But of course, conversion was also the order of the day. Here you have an image of a Muslim festival known as Muharram or Hosay, very, very spectacular. And this was constructed, these tazias, or these monuments were constructed even during the indenture period with the sparse resources. So it shows a lot of the creativity of the people. Now, I'll move quickly into the termination of the system. In 1917, the system was formally brought to an end. However, people, were already contracted and so on. So we can say when they completed their periods of contract by 1920, the system was formally ended. Okay, reasons for indentureship was multifold, but we have to remember the main reason was the declining profitability of the system to the British. It was becoming, in their eyes, it became less and less profitable to keep bringing these Indians. Then, of course, Gandhi had taken up the situation of the indentured Indians in South Africa and was fighting against the system since then. When he went back to India, the Indian national movement, some members took up the cause of the Indians within the structure of the Indian system. And, they also argued against the system and highlighted its atrocities and so on. Even before Gandhi, however, the anti-slavery lobbyists very early on took on this issue of indentureship, and they also kept a close eye on indenture and outlined and highlighted some of the atrocities of the system and so on. There are many commissions of inquiry throughout the indentureship period that again highlighted the system and its negative impact on the people and so forth, the poor conditions. So basically you had a continued highlighting of the negativity of the system, but at the end of the day, by the time you got to 1970, the British realized that it was not as profitable as it was earlier on, and they decided, well, of course, World War I would also be a factor, small factor, but nevertheless, because they now had to concentrate their military and other resources on the World War effort. So all put together, the system was brought to an end in 1917. But remember, there were no real humanitarian reasons on the part of the British for ending the system, all right? No, they would make humanitarian arguments, but those were not the reasons. It all had to do with dollars and cents and profitability. All right, beyond the estates, many Indians, as I said, chose to remain in the Caribbean. I'll wrap up now. They moved off from 1880s. Some of them lived close to the estates because they continued to work on the estates. Some continued living on the estates. But those who moved off, that period signified the beginning of homes and village networks and reconstruction of social, religious, and cultural institutions as they would have known it in India. Some communities, of course, over time, all communities will integrate into the larger society, but in some communities, that integration and assimilation would be quicker, like in those areas with smallest numbers of Indians, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent. Very quickly, the community was integrated into the larger society. Very quickly, Indians in some of these communities realized that the acquisition of land and education were two very key agents of social mobility. So emphasis was placed on acquiring education, formal education and land. And this is just a picture of a typical early post-indenture village. This is a Presbyterian church. They use Indian names, Jagat Ka Prakash, to entice the Indians into the church. Contributions made by the Indians to the development of the sugarcane industry, introduction of wet rice cultivation, growth of the cocoa and coffee industries also, to agriculture and food production generally. Indians became first of all, small business owners, and then of course, large business owners. Some of them were estate owners, and you had them entering from about the 1920s, 30s into the various professions. And this is just a scene of Hindus conducting a prayers for the welfare of the society, the colony during the World War II period, an image of an Indian woman to end it off. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I do hope that it was informative and helped throw light on, the system known as Indian indenture. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Singh. It was certainly very, very informative. I would describe it as masterful and very enlightening.
Thank you.
And we have many questions. We have at least a dozen questions. And that's why I came on, to be sure that we would have time so that you could treat with some of these questions from our listening audience. If I could look at some of them now. One person asks, what sort of compensation would be given to the so-called recruiters when they successfully kidnap a would-be indentured worker? That's one question.
Yeah. The licensed recruiter was paid a shilling per head, yeah, per Indian. So the Arcatias, these recruiters that he employed, they would be even paid less. They would be paid less. So they were paid per head.
Okay, and then I would give you two other questions so that you could treat with. One question, this is from Talking History in Jamaica. What were the gender differences in the recruitment process? That's one question. Then we have another question. How integral was the East India Company in destabilizing India?
Okay, so the first one is gender differences. Well, as I said,
Yeah.
there was a big discrepancy in recruitment because first of all, the emphasis was on able-bodied male labor. You have more labor output, heavier labor output from males. So they were focused, but of course, eventually, very quickly, they realized that it would not work unless there were women around. For various reasons. So, they did attempt to bring women, but even throughout the entire system, the emphasis was always on men. There were all sorts of excuses made that they couldn't find the right type of women, etc., or they couldn't find enough. But the point is, males were the ones who provided more labor than women. And that was the reason for focusing on men, on male labor, rather than. So the best it got was 2-to-1.
And okay, so what was the impact of that among the indentured Indians in the Caribbean on their estates would be a question.
Definitely, negatively it did impact because family life could not be created. It was unstable. It created a situation that worked, we can argue, in the favor of women in the sense that they were now prized property. Whereas in India, like if you look at a typical marriage scenario, the woman would pay dowry to the husband, but now it was flipped, a bride price, because the women were the ones who they were the prize. You didn't have much of them. So, if you got a woman, you got a prize. So, so the marriage situation would be where the man would pay the woman's family that bride price. And of course, what would happen, as I said, there were no legal sanctions. So there was nothing legal about this union. So, and there were no structures put in place. So, you would have that couple, maybe some ritual or not maybe done. And over time, there was nothing holding the woman from leaving. So, and of course, it's a situation with many men and a few women. So you would have men, as you say, making passes at these women and nothing holding them together. So they might leave a relationship with one man to go to live with another man. And then that would, erupt in violence. Sometimes it wouldn't, sometimes it would, where the scorned man would, take it upon himself to take up his only weapon, which is the cutlass, and then try to defend his honor in the only way that he thought he knew how, which was to beat the woman or to use the cutlass on the woman, whether she was chopped. Sometimes it resulted in death. And even if he got hold of the new beau or spouse, he would, feel the brunt of it too. So this what's popularly termed as wife murders during the indenture system, it is a scourge, or was a scourge of the system. But again, I would place the fault on the British because they made not enough attempt to even out the ratio of women to men. And in terms of the East India Company, by the time you got to the 1830s, the East India Company had been dissolved, and the British Crown was now in charge of India. So yes, early on, the East India Company was the initial anchor of the British in India. But when you got to the 1830s, it was not functional in that way anymore.
Okay. So another question, was there redress if the contract was breached by the indentured Indians? And was there compensation for injury incurred during the indentureship?
Redress if they were breached? No. If the contracts were breached, as I said, in terms like, okay, so if they were breached by the Indians, that would be staying away from work. Basically, that's how they would breach their contract. Yeah, staying away from work, feigning illness. So there, what would happen, as I said, they would either be fined, put in jail, or the days missed added on to their contract. In terms of if the planter breached the contract, hardly ever. As I was explaining, the Indian would have to, one, know that the contract was being breached, or two, have deep knowledge of the contract, and three, be able to financially afford legal counsel if the protector of immigrants refused. And most of the times, the protector of immigrants, if he saw that the Indians wanted to take it to court, it might, he might deter them. And if it got to court, then of course, legal counsel would be a problem, paying for legal counsel. And most of the times, the magistrates, so it was like hurdle upon hurdle at each step. The magistrates would be pro-colonialism. He would fight in favor of the planters. So even if the planters breach the contract, the Indians usually still suffered for it anyway.
Yeah. So moving on to other questions. How did the caste system affect the socio-cultural relations in the Caribbean?
Okay, so as the table showed, you had like maybe 11 to 14% varying in terms of the various regions of what you could call high caste. Now, most of the individuals came from the lower end caste, all right, lower agricultural caste. Now, very quickly, caste boundaries dissolved, okay? Even before they came to the Caribbean, even before some of them got on the ship, while they were on the depot. Now, as per the caste system, for example, high caste people couldn't even sit next to or share a meal with or share toileting facilities with people of lower caste. You become polluted. But as soon as they got to the depot, none of that was observed. You share the same toilet, you ate the same food, sometimes cooked by a high caste person, sometimes not. And of course, you share the same space. All right. Sometimes on the depots, women, single women who found themselves there, because of how Indian society was structured then, they formed alliances with men right away, or if the men formed alliances with women, because it was, a woman, had a better status if she was not single, an adult woman. Yeah. So that also would break down caste boundaries, because nobody's thinking about whether you're high caste or low caste. Now, so boundaries started to dilute when they came to the Caribbean. Again, whatever boundaries was there went, because nobody is considering, when you are being assigned to estates, whether a high caste person should go or a low caste person. All right. So the structure of caste, the actual structure of the system, broke down very quickly. What you have remaining, maybe even today, is very diluted ideologies. And it has to do more with when you get to the performance of rituals, the idea of priests. So, for example, the most visible one is where some people might still want a Brahmin priest to perform their rituals, but there are growing numbers of individuals who would say it doesn't matter once the person has knowledge of the rituals and the verses and so on. So caste very quickly diluted, and also there were no social systems and structures put in place until after indentureship to reconstruct community, to reconstruct these ideas and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Just wondering if immigration agent was at Calcutta Depot. What about the port of Madras? The people from the South India often forgotten.
Yes, definitely. So you had immigration agents at all ports, in the South, in Madras, and also Calcutta. Yes, you had them at all ports.
At all.
Yeah, yes. So because most of the people who came to the Caribbean were from the north, there is this preponderance of north, but you do have that sprinkling of South Indian.
Okay. So the next question, and I know you dealt with the unfree labor aspect of indentureship, and it wasn't really voluntary, but this person asked a question. If persons were tricked for the voyages, kidnapped, then would the indentureship be termed voluntary? Or is it because most of the persons went voluntarily that it is termed as voluntary?
As I said, before the 1870s, so we're looking from 1830 to around the 1870s, that was a period where there was a lot of what we can call involuntariness because of the trickery and the stories being painted, not true stories of the whole situation. But by the time you got to the 1870s, the system had become more and more known. So we can say from the 1870s until the end of the system, people knew. So we can argue then it was voluntary during that time because they knew, basically had a better idea of what. So those who engage the system from the 1870s. So I'm supposing, yes, that's why they might say it's voluntary, but we can't, totally obliterate the fact that there was a period, maybe 30 years, if my math is good, 20 years or so, that it was largely involuntary.
So this next question takes us back, I would think, to the imbalance between the male and female in terms of the demographics. How prevalent were interracial marriages on the estates? And what was the legal status of the children from unions?
Okay.
I suspect they probably mean children of interracial marriages, I suppose.
All right. On the estates, interracial marriages would not have been prevalent because the Indians couldn't leave the estates. And then they would not have, like non-Indians, I would say Africans coming on the estates. So on the estates, no. Interracial marriages started to happen. Well, remember, people were moving out of the estate sometimes from as early as when they finished their indenture. So let's say you came in 1838, or let's take 1845 when the system really happened. Let's say you came in 1845, you completed everything by 10 years. By 1855, you could move off the estate if you wanted to. Yeah. So people were moving off in, in small amounts, small pockets. So those people who moved off, they could form these unions, but I would say that these unions were not the norm. Interracial unions were not the norm, especially on the estates. It would have been restrictive, but those who moved off, it was not the norm. It was very much the exception rather than norm. And it depended if you had, whether even with Indians or interracial unions, once you registered with what we call the warden's office or the equivalent, then your marriage with the state, then your marriage was seen as legal. So Indians had that option, but they didn't want to, in the sense that they were not accustomed to it. In India, all you did was you did your ceremony and you're married. So they didn't understand this formalization with the form and so on. So whether it was Indian and Indian, once they registered in the state, it was seen as legal. And if it was Indian and non-Indian, once the marriage was registered, only then was it seen as legal. And the children would be treated, whether Indian or mixed. If the union was not registered formally, they would be treated as bastards. And those were the words that were actually used in documents.
All right. So you did talk about the nature of the journey, but there is a question, perhaps you could elaborate on that. What was the journey like for the Indians?
Okay.
I know you mentioned.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, as I said, maybe 3 months with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, a bit shorter, maybe 6 weeks to 2 months. I'll just go through it in terms of a day. So the Indians, they slept under deck, right. They were segregated. There were 3 sections. One section underneath for single males, then single females, and then a section for married couples. They were brought up on deck every day. Usually they would only be required to go underneath during the night, so if the weather was bad. During the day, they were brought up on deck. Of course, they would clean and so forth. They were given 2 meals per day, 1 light meal, and then a main meal that was cooked, Indian, maybe rice and dal, onions or roti or vegetable or something like that. There was meat also on board. The other meal would be lighter, maybe crackers and so forth. They were encouraged to exercise because, it would work to the benefit of the authorities if they landed them healthy and able. So they were encouraged to exercise. They were encouraged to keep themselves occupied, whether in some kind of sport or entertainment, to sing, to dance. They were encouraged, stick fighting. Indians were fans of stick fighting. So you had that just to keep their minds off of it. But of course, outbreaks, or the same outbreaks on the plantations, like dysentery, yellow fever, all these smallpox, because once one person had it, remember, it's a ship, closed space, so it spread very quickly. So there was a very high mortality rate on many of these voyages. Okay. And of course, people would be just thrown overboard, the dead would be thrown overboard. So very high mortality rate on many voyages. What else? So yeah, basically that's it. As I said, you had abuse of women on the ships by especially the sailors and so forth. And then when the weather was bad, everybody had to go underneath and see it. So, I mean, if there's anything specific you would like to know, they'll just kind of tell me.
Okay, well, I'm just asking the questions. I guess I just wanted more information in terms of what the actual experience was like, in addition to the information you had already provided.
Nobody was in shackles. I think that's nobody was. Yes, it was.
Okay,
Yes.
so they could move about the ships.
There were no restrictions like that, like the African slaves had, no. So, but you couldn't move about freely, but there were not restrictions, physical restrictions like that. Yeah.
And the mortality, did you mention the mortality? Was there a mortality rate, a significant
Yes, the mortality rate was, on many ships, it was high. Sometimes it would cross over 50, depending, on the diseases and so forth. And some Indians, especially in the early period, they're very depressed when they realized they were leaving. So, they just kind of this general sense of malaise and depression and so on. Some of them attempted to throw themselves overboard, because they realized they were leaving India and so forth. So it varied. The mortality rate, again, especially in the early period, would be very high on certain ships.
So did that fact of the mortality rate influence the numbers that they would try to get on a ship? So, for example, in the case of the slave trade, they would have to tight pack and loose pack because they would cater for how many they, would die on the trip and so on.
You would say it, maybe there was never a regulation. They would say it, with the mouth and so forth. But there was never, because the ships would carry from, let's say, between over 150 to sometimes close to 300. Mm-hmm. Okay? So there was never, that was never main consideration in recruitment. Okay. The idea was to fill the ship to capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another question here. In its treatment of the workers, Indian indentureship between 1845 and 1917 in Trinidad proved to be simply another form of slavery. Does the evidence support this statement?
In terms of the treatment of workers, I would still say no, because yes, the Indians were beaten. Yes, they were flogged. Yes, they were, rape is rape. Let's not include that, all right? So the women were raped. But in terms of the intensity of the beatings and the physical abuse, the African enslaved individuals definitely were treated worse than the Indians. And at the end of the day, the Africans were treated as property, whereas the Indians were treated, we can say maybe as property, but as sources of labor for a certain period of time. Whereas until abolition, the African slaves were treated as property for their entire lifetime. That in itself is a gross abuse, in my perspective, my view that is. So, but in terms of the physical treatment of the slaves and the Indians, I would say that the slaves were treated worse than the Indians, most definitely.
So you use the term, it was a form of unfreedom. Mm-hmm. And in your presentation, you described all of the factors that would have impacted that. But could you elaborate a bit on that term, unfreedom? What exactly is a state of unfreedom?
Okay.
Could you expand on that?
Yeah. So now, if we look at various systems let's take various systems of labor, because freedom is a large idea. So I'll just use it within this context of labor. Yes. Mm-hmm. So you have a situation where, okay, let's take contemporary. I am a shoemaker. You bring your shoe to me and you pay me for my labor. So in that way, you buy my labor as a shoemaker. Or I work for a company, you pay me, and that I'm free in that sense. I've sold my labor and you have bought it. Within the context of Indian indenture, there were, and not just indentureship, before indentureship, there were certain systems in India that we can term as unfree, carrying certain shades of unfreedom. So, for example, with the indentureship system, yes, there was a contract. Yes, the Indians were paid. Yes, they signed signed, so to speak, this contract. They thumbprinted this contract. Yes, so the exchange of wages for labor, that is the element of freedom, all right? And others also. But the thing is, it did not happen as per the contract. So we can argue the contract had nothing that the Indians could not leave the plantation. There was nothing in the contract that said curtailment of movement. Yeah. So even if an Indian, could have read the contract, nothing in that contract told him or her that you couldn't leave the plantation. You had to get permission. So that is one element of that idea of unfreedom. You could not leave, but you did not know before that you couldn't leave. So it's all here. It's a psychological thing in that sense, as in addition to the physical restrictions. Yes. So, for example, an Indian who we would say is free from indenture, he or she had to carry that paper with him or her. So just simply saying I'm no longer indentured is not enough. So that in itself is also unfreedom. Okay, so we have to look deeper in terms of what constructs this idea of unfreedom. It's not a simple I work and you pay kind of situation. There are other elements that would give you the shades of unfreedom.
Yes. Okay, so we have another question. What was the reason for change in surnames for Indians? Was it by choice on the part of the Indians, or were they coerced?
It was kind of like neither. It was more, had to do with the framework. They were living in a colonial framework, all right? As per colonialism, you have a first name and a surname. When I was explaining the little immigration pass, the Indians on that pass, all they had was a first name. So on the name, you have a first name, but they asked for father's name. All right, so they gave it. So what the British did eventually, not even during indenture, all right, post indenture now, when the Indian had to engage society as an let's say no longer indentured person, all right. For official reasons now, for example, let's say an Indian decides, all right, I want my children to not be considered bastards. I want them to inherit my property. The safest way before in the 1930s or so in many colonies was to register the marriage. Yeah. Now, to register the marriage, as per official documentation, you need a first name and a last name, a surname. So they would ask the Indian his name, he or she would give his name, and then they would ask for surname. And usually the Indian would come up blank. It's like, what is this? And then the easier question would be, what is your father's name? And then father's name, the Indian would give his father's name, and that would now be used, by the British and the authorities as that is their surname. So you had your name and your surname. So it wasn't forced saying you have to, but if you wanted certain benefits, then you had to, yes.
In terms of the legacies of the system of indentureship, I mean, they're both economic, they're cultural, religious, all kinds. Could you probably didn't have time to focus on this, but could you elaborate a bit on the cultural impact of the indentured Indians on Caribbean society?
Yes, time ran out, and I thought, well, that is the aspect that most people know anyway. So I chose to.
Yeah.
Yes. So, well, culturally, I mean, there's so much. I would say that, people look at what we call Indian culture, but a point that I will highlight right away, two things. One, this culture has come from a subcontinent that is very varied. So we in the Caribbean, we tend to treat it as a homogeneous kind of element, but it isn't. It draws from all parts of India. And secondly, it has been adapted in ways that even Indians are not aware of sometimes to the Caribbean context, So we have so many facets of culture. We have food, that's one of the most popular ones. We have religious practices. We have cultural practices. We have dress. We have, so they're almost pervasive in, throughout the Caribbean. But I would say that, they've taken on many elements of the Caribbean. So, for example, this is my favorite example to give ever. Let's say Trinidad, and I think also in Guyana too. The most prominent, herb or seasoning used in curry is shadow benny, right? But that's not so in India. So you say, well, so how come? Now the Indians in this context, they came, nobody brought them spices, they just had the basics. And going about their merry business, they found this shadow benny, as we call it. And the smell and the taste was very similar to a North Indian spice, the prominent spice used in North Indian food, which is known as dhania. So they used it, and the Hindi term, no, the Bhojpuri term for that spice is dhania.
Yeah.
And ban means wild. So it's wild dhania. So like that, adjustments were made that has become part of our Caribbean Indianness. It is part, so many people, like when I speak to my students, they don't know that this issue, and then many of the rituals and like the weddings and the pujas and so on, when you look at the Caribbean, throughout the Caribbean, you see this, let's say take the wedding, for example, it's done, but really, it almost borrows various elements of wedding ceremonies from various parts of India, So like the walking around the fire, the using of the garlands, the whole Friday and Saturday night ceremonies. So it borrows, it's like a composite culture rather. So we should never go away trying to think that it's a homogeneous one.
Right. And if you could talk a bit about the way in which Diwali was introduced. What was how did it come about? And there's a question here. What is the difference between curry chicken and chicken curry? I didn't know there was a difference, but there's a question.
Okay, I understand what they're trying to say. I think curry chicken is our, it has to do with language too, eh? Yeah, so I think, okay, we in the Caribbean say curry chicken because in English we put our adjectives before our noun. So we say the red car, all right? Now the car red, and using the colloquial part, right? So curry chicken, that's my take on it. But then when you say chicken curry, you hear that when Indians from India refer to their food.
Okay.
Yeah? Because in the language, the adjective comes after. So if you translate it, you get chicken curry like that. But that's just my take on it.
So it's a linguistic thing more than a culinary thing.
Yeah, but when you generally curry chicken is used to refer to Caribbean curry chicken, and chicken curry is used to refer to Indian, chicken curry.
Okay. So I'm just checking to see if we have any other questions. I think I have posed all of the questions that have come up before me. All right.
If I can ask one, Sandra.
Certainly.
Yes, Dr. Singh, I understood from my time in Guyana that in some parts of the Indian subcontinent, particularly from Sri Lanka, which would have been later divisions of the Indian continent, that in relation to the one word names, or names, the one word names, that sometimes, depending on the length, there are stories packed into the length of that name, that the carrier of the name can trace his or her family, etc., origin on that name, whereas the British, like you just pointed out, would see it just as an anomaly, it's too long. And that sort of boiled down, because in Guyana, I remember working with a guy called Harry at the Mirror newspaper, and he gave us what he gave as a joke of a guy who was called Cowpat. And he said that was just his brief name, but he only had one name, and he had an account in that one name. And eventually, over Domino's once, we asked him his complete name, and he said it was too long to remember. Well, I did remember. It was Kaupatlal Karamchandas Gokulandan Tiranga Bagi.
Very good.
Very good.
And his history was a mile long. I actually wrote it out in the newspaper once and challenged people, because I also had a radio program. But these are some of the some of the stories and the messages that we need to be able to share, like you just did with the chicken curry vis-a-vis curry chicken. My favorite so-called Indian wedding aspect is the seven curry. What can you tell us about the seven curry?
That is it's a Guyanese practice, no?
Yes.
No. Yes. Yeah, I think, well, it has to, let's say different areas would have different ideas, and I think that is more like a South Indian idea. But I mean, if you look throughout, if you go to Hindu weddings, even Muslim weddings, there wouldn't be one dish.
Yes.
So some would prescribe maybe a sort of religious element or a sociocultural element, but it's there. The idea almost practical now. You know, it's a feast, so you don't have just one or two dishes, but you have a multitude of dishes. But some says that, you know, well, this is how it's to be done traditionally. You must have at least 7 dishes, so to speak.
Thank you, Doctor.
Welcome.
Okay, Dr. Singh, I have a couple comments. Some listeners are sharing, and I would share them also with you for your comment as well. And that was, let's see, this one here. Talking about the voluntary aspect or involuntary aspect of indentureship, as the case might be, one listener, one participant makes a statement, this is Chelsea. The Arcatias in India and the African persons who sold other Africans. Well, it seemed to be suggesting that the Arcatias in India were tricked, as well as those persons who were sold into slavery by other Africans were tricked. That's just one comment. Another comment is, and this is from Talking History in Jamaica. For some countries, the system stopped before 1917. The last ship for Jamaica was 1916. I guess that's just sharing some information. You may want to make a comment about that. And I saw, yes, another comment again from Chelsea. South Indians worship Kali and still perform Kali Mai Pujas, a practice not looked at favorably by the North Indian migrants.
Kali Mai Puja.
Yes. All right. So Arcatias, I'll take the first one. Arcatias and African, what I would call, I think that the person is trying to draw a parallel between the Arcatias who recruited the Indians and those persons who recruited Africans also, that they both use trickery, especially for the Indians in the early period to recruit. And that is definitely so. I would agree with that parallel. In terms of, well, yes, excuse me, in terms of the ending of indenture. Yes, there were some colonies. Now remember, it was brought formally, the regulation was passed to terminate the shipping of Indians in 1917. But there would have been places where, okay, the ship would not have left before. If a ship did not leave when that regulation was passed, India, it would not leave. It would not be allowed to leave again. Some places the ship was on way. Yeah, so they had to, you know, so you would have people landing even after the regulation was passed because the ship would have already been en route. Yeah, and then also, even though the regulation was passed in 1917, as I said, remember people, well, let's say somebody came just before, a shipload came just before the regulation, and they started their period at that point in 1917, then it would have to be 1920 that it would end. So the regulation passed did not put any restriction on those contracts that were already signed and delivered, so to speak. So that's why you have the formal regulation in 1917, but the ending of the system itself, 1920, when all contracts were completed. Yeah? Yes. And in terms of Kali Mai Puja, yes, Kali Mai Puja, it's still practiced throughout the Caribbean. It is essentially a South Indian, but also a Bengali, which is from northeastern part of India. It's Bengali and also South Indian practice. North Indians in the Caribbean people of North Indian descent, let me see. They tend to look down on it. And I think in India also some of them do. In the Caribbean, it is seen more as folk practice. So, and it wasn't a problem in the early indenture period. It became a problem after indentureship ended, when people started to construct communities. And there was this move, you know, Indian organizations started to take root, social, religious, cultural. There was this move almost to standardize religion as per the larger society and its norms, even to the, to the effect, to the extent of some groups wanting to say, well, Hinduism doesn't have many gods, there's one God, so to speak. So the idea of kind of almost fitting in with perspectives and views of the larger society. So in this way, Kali worship, and of course, many facets, many people who perform Kali worship, they sacrifice, maybe a chicken or a goat and so forth. So this was very distasteful even early on, in terms of the larger Christian society. They saw this as barbaric, those are the words they use. So in the effort to construct community within a larger Christianized, context, first of all, also colonialized, certain elements like the Kali Puja were being looked down upon by more North Indian oriented Hindus. And even up to now, they look at it with askance at least, or with some sort of scorn, or remove themselves from it.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the question and answer session. And before we move on to the vote of thanks from Mr. Bousquet, Dr. Singh, maybe you would like to share some final thoughts?
I just want to say, again, I'm really, really happy that this forum was created, because as I was telling Mr. Bousquet, it almost has become a norm that indentureship is almost left out, especially of the school curriculum, or it's treated, as part of a very small, another subtopic or something, or part of a subtopic even, and I would really like it to be a situation where one day, and this is very extreme, where maybe even the syllabus could be revised to have, indentureship given a bit more focus, because at the end of the day, it is a system that was implemented and brought, over 500,000 people to the Caribbean. It is a system that ended up coloring the Caribbean in so many ways. It has impacted on the Caribbean in all ways, socially, culturally, politically, and so forth, you name it. So I would really, it would be, it would be remiss of me if I didn't say, express how I felt in terms of how it is dealt with generally. And again, that I'm quite happy that, the Reparations Committee actually saw, what indentureship, or where indentureship should be standing within our knowledge and our Caribbean intellectual tradition. Yes, so once again, thank you for recognizing this, and also for asking me to speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, and we will certainly pass on your comments as well to the Director of the Center for Reparations Research, Professor Shepard. So it is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Bousquet to deliver the vote of thanks.
And thank you, Dr. Gift, and what an education we have all had, and not only the students, teachers, persons at school. And we want to start off by thanking the schools, the students, the principals, the teachers, the parents, the others everywhere who helped make today the success that it has been, primarily by way of the number of questions that we have had to, that we received and were able to answer. It is this lecture that has featured the most questions. We had 12 right from the start, and we also had comments, quite a few also from Talking History. We want to start off by thanking Talking History in Jamaica for the active participation. We want to thank Chelsea for the repeated questions. We want to thank our lecturer, Dr. Sharian Singh, the head of the related faculty at UWI St. Augustine, and Dr. Singh. You did deliver as expected, and we are glad that you did feel the way you did about being invited. And I do share, I can say we in St. Lucia do share your dream, and we hope that it can become a reality much earlier than you think, and that is the possibility for indentureship to get more attention in the regional school curriculum, because as you have just proven through your very thorough presentation, it is an issue that has been both overlooked and underplayed, and therefore we are hoping that today's lecture, coming on the penultimate day of April, will open the way for all who have been listening and all who can influence and plan for next month's various observances of Indian Arrival Day in Trinidad, in St. Lucia, wherever. What we seem to have is different countries, like I said, having different dates, but all countries have an Indian presence, so to speak, and therefore the observance should be one that is national, and that can be an objective to be pursued even by our reparations movements within the context of our general purview. We want to thank Michael Hilton of the UWI's Center for Reparations Research, and the team operating and working with Professor Shepard in Jamaica. Of course, it is a very dedicated team, folks. They meet voluntarily and they work on a regular basis with us to keep these lectures going, and the selections that end up with presentations like today are given much thought. And as Dr. Giff pointed out at the beginning, they are considered within the context of the curriculum that prepares the questions and the issues related to history classes at your secondary schools today. We want to thank our ever-present team at UWI Open Campus EDU, David Foster, Sharice, Glasgow, and of course, Dr. Sam. They have been with us from the night before and throughout the sessions, both at the national level. We had our national lecture here on Tuesday and this one here on Thursday. And folks, those are the people we do not see, we do not hear, but they are the people without whom we cannot do anything that we have done today. And by no means last or least, Sandra, her role as our moderator a second time, as a visiting lecturer also with the Center for Reparations Research. Her previous role in the Department of Quality and Standards at University of the West Indies has assisted in her bringing a certain level of insistence on clarity and in preparedness, and ensuring, like I keep on saying, that our work, what we present, is in keeping with what you have to do. And therefore, it is my pleasure to thank everybody else whose name I have not yet called, but who contributed to today being the success that it has been. Stay tuned for our next regional lecture, which will be on the fourth Thursday of May. And it is regular that our lectures take place, the national lectures on the third week of the month, the third Thursday of the month, and the regional lectures on the fourth Thursday of the month. So you could take that down as your dates to remember, even without remembering the actual month or date. So thanks everybody once again, and it's back to you, Dr. Gift.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bousquet. And colleagues, I have to let you know that Mr. Bousquet is certainly one of the key live wires guiding this virtual lecture series. And he's always very energetic and enthusiastic, and it really helps to buoy us all. Thank you again very much, Mr. Buski, for your vote of thanks. And I really also want to give my personal thanks as well to Dr. Singh again for what I think is a masterful presentation. It was very thorough. It was very, very clear. And I'm sure it would benefit our students in deriving a greater and a deeper appreciation of the whole system of indentureship, and in particular in terms of what the topic says, how deceptive it was, in terms of all of the factors which would have taken away from the voluntary nature of the system, as well as all of the deceptions around the provisions of the contract, in contrast with the actual realities of the lived experience of the indentured workers on the estates. So thank you very much again, Dr. Singh. And as I close, I would just to make some remarks, reiterate sort of, some points about the system of indentureship. It made available to planters a core group of resident, unfree laborers, as Dr. Singh said, whose work was completely dependable. Following emancipation, they were the principal source of guaranteed labor available to the planters. It was indentured laborers from India who provided the solution to the planters' difficulties. While it was the sugar industry that gained the most from Indian immigration, indentureship in Trinidad, for example, resulted in the establishment of a significant Indian peasant proprietorship arising from the opting for land as opposed to returning to India, for example, the production of a local food supply, reducing dependence on importation of provisions and vegetables, and the diversification of agriculture. They kept the estates going, opened up the country, and were taxpayers, proprietors, and merchants. As they acquired a degree of economic independence and stability, the outlines of an Indian community emerged with its own religious celebrations and festivals, an autonomous social organization, and an awakening group consciousness. We do hope that today's lecture has been helpful to you, our students, and our teachers in obtaining a deeper understanding of the topic of indentureship, and look forward to you joining us for the next lecture on the 27th of May, 2021. This brings us to the end of today's lecture, and I wish you all a continuing very good day. See you next time. Bye.